At 5:31 a.m. on October 24, 1944, radio technician Second Class Walter Pemberton crouched in the communications room of the destroyer USS Johnston off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippines, listening to static on a frequency he wasn't supposed to be monitoring. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. He'd been awake for 19 hours straight, hunched over equipment he'd modified 3 nights earlier with copper tubing and wire he'd stolen from the engine room. The modification was unauthorized, court-martial offense. But Walt had watched 2 radio men die in the past 6 weeks because American ships couldn't detect Japanese fleets until they were already in gun range. He'd done the math. Standard SG radar maxed out at 120 miles in perfect conditions. Radio direction finding was unreliable beyond 80 miles. The Japanese knew this. They used it. Walt adjusted the headset. The static shifted, faint, rhythmic, multiple sources. He grabbed a pencil. His hand froze over the plotting sheet. Those signal patterns were Japanese naval codes, and they were broadcasting from at least 200 miles northwest, which meant Admiral Kurita's center force was exactly where American intelligence said it wouldn't be. Walter James Pemberton was 26 years old, a Cleveland kid who'd spent 6 years before the war working at his uncle's radio repair shop on Euclid Avenue. He'd enlisted 2 days after Pearl Harbor, not because of patriotism exactly, because he'd been listening to the radio when the announcement came through, and he'd heard the static beneath the announcer's voice, and he'd thought, someone's got to fix that. That's how Walt's brain worked. He saw problems as puzzles, equipment failures as challenges. The Navy had made him a radio technician second class, assigned him to the Johnston in June 1944, 4 months on board, 53 days at sea. He'd learned the MATE, ship's radio suite inside and out, TBS radio for short-range tactical communication, SC-2 air search radar, SG surface search radar, and the RDF, radio direction finding equipment that theoretically could triangulate enemy transmissions. Theoretically. In reality, the RDF was garbage beyond 80 miles. The antenna configuration was designed for Atlantic convoy operations, not Pacific fleet actions. Different wavelengths, different atmospheric conditions, different enemy transmission patterns. Walt had filed 3 formal reports requesting equipment modifications, all denied. Outside technical specifications. Requires Bureau of Ships authorization. Not mission critical. He'd stopped filing reports after Radioman Third Class Tommy Chen. All-Shin died. Tommy Chen, 21 years old, San Francisco. Second-generation Chinese-American who spoke Cantonese with his mom and talked baseball with everyone else. Tommy had been monitoring frequencies on the bridge of the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay on September 12, 1944, when a Japanese cruiser appeared out of a rain squall at 14 miles. No radar warning, no radio intercept. The cruiser fired 9 salvos before the Gambier Bay could even turn. Tommy had been standing at his station when the 4th salvo penetrated the communications room. Walt had known Tommy for 6 weeks. They'd shared cigarettes, swapped stories about radio equipment. Tommy had shown him photos of his sister's wedding. The Navy gave Tommy's mother a folded flag and a telegram. 3 weeks later, on October 3, 1944, Radioman First Class David Hayes died on the destroyer USS Hole during a screening operation north of Morotai. David was 31 years old, married, father of 2 daughters in Boise, Idaho. He'd been in the Navy since 1938, most experienced radio operator in Taffy 3. He'd spent the previous month trying to recalibrate the Hoel's RDF equipment to detect Japanese transmissions at longer range. He'd been close to a solution. Walt had talked with him about antenna configurations during a supplies transfer. David had figured out that if you extended the dipole elements and adjusted the receiver frequency slightly outside standard parameters, You could pick up Japanese naval codes at maybe 120 miles instead of 80. Just need authorization to modify the equipment, David had told him. Filed the request. Should hear back in 6 weeks. On October 3rd, a Japanese submarine surfaced 9 miles from the Hoel. Fired 3 torpedoes. The Hoel's radar hadn't detected the submarine's approach because the sub had been running on batteries at periscope depth. David had been monitoring standard frequencies, not the lower frequency bands where Japanese submarines occasionally transmitted position reports. The second torpedo hit directly below the communications room. David Hayes and 4 other sailors died instantly. Walt had requested permission to attend the memorial service. Denied. Combat operations require full communications staff on duty. He'd stood on the Johnston's deck that evening smoking, thinking about Tommy Chen. Saw photographs. David Hayes's daughters. The bureaucratic phrase, outside technical specifications. 2 men dead. Both because American radio equipment couldn't detect enemy forces until they were close enough to kill you. That fraction of distance meant everything. It was the difference between detecting a Japanese cruiser at 120 miles, time enough to scramble fighters, position ships, prepare defenses, and detecting it at 14 miles, when you had maybe 6 minutes before the first salvos hit. Walt had stopped requesting authorization, started collecting copper tubing instead. The technical problem was simple. American shipboard radio direction finding equipment used a loop antenna configuration designed to triangulate medium-frequency transmissions at Tatooine, ranges up to 100 miles. But Japanese naval communications primarily used high-frequency transmissions that scattered differently in tropical atmospheric conditions. The signal-to-noise ratio degraded rapidly beyond 80 miles. By 100 miles, you were listening to static. The solution was also simple. Extend the antenna elements, increase the aperture, shift the receiver tuning to capture slightly longer wavelengths. 30 minutes of work with basic tools. But the TBM-2 radio direction finder installed on American destroyers was built by RCA under a fixed Navy contract. Modifying it voided the warranty, required Bureau of Ships authorization, which required submitting Form 47902K with technical justification, routing it through Squadron Command, Fleet Command, and BUSHIP's headquarters in Washington. Processing time, 6 to 8 weeks. Walt had submitted his first modification request on July 2, 1944. He'd included detailed technical drawings, mathematical analysis of signal propagation, references to David Hayes's preliminary research. The response came back on August 14th. Request denied. Proposed modifications exceed authorized technical parameters. Equipment performance meets design specifications. Equipment performance met design specifications. That was the phrase that made Walt want to put his fist through a bulkhead. Yes, the equipment met design specifications. For Atlantic convoy operations against German U-boats. Not for Pacific Fleet actions against Japanese cruisers and battleships that could put shells through your hull from 20 miles away. But BUSHIPs didn't care about operational context. They cared about contractual specifications and liability. Walt filed a second request on August 20th, this time emphasizing the operational need, citing Tommy Chen's death, explaining that longer detection range could prevent casualties. The response came back on September 18th. Request denied. Casualty reports do not demonstrate equipment failure. Radioman error and tactical circumstances were contributing factors. Radioman error. They'd blamed Tommy Chen for not detecting a cruiser that his equipment physically couldn't detect. Walt had read that response 3 times. Then he'd folded the paper carefully, put it in his locker, and started planning which equipment to steal from the machine shop. On October 8, 1944, Radioman 3rd Class Patrick Sullivan died on the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts during a night convoy operation east of Leyte. Patrick was 19 years old, Boston kid, Irish Catholic family, 8 siblings. He'd been in the Navy for 11 months, still learning the radio equipment, still asking Walt questions during frequency drills about how to distinguish Japanese transmissions from American ones. The Sullivan had been screening a convoy of landing ships when a Japanese destroyer squadron appeared at 12 miles. No radar contact, no radio warning. The first indication was visual, lookouts spotting muzzle flashes in the darkness. Patrick had been at his station, monitoring standard frequencies, doing everything by the book. The Japanese destroyer fired 8 salvos in 90 seconds. The third salvo hit the Roberts Bridge. The fourth hit the communications room. Patrick's body was recovered from the wreckage. He'd still been wearing his headset. Walt heard about it from the Johnston's communications officer during the morning brief on October 9th. The officer read the casualty report. Then he'd looked at Walt and said, "That's 3 radio men in 6 weeks. You notice a pattern?" Walt had noticed. They all had. Japanese fleet doctrine was to approach at high speed, strike hard, and withdraw before American forces could respond. They knew American radar struggled beyond 120 miles. They knew American RDF couldn't reliably track fleet movements beyond 80 miles. So they attacked from longer range. They used weather patterns for concealment. They transmitted position reports in brief, high-frequency bursts that American equipment couldn't cleanly intercept. And American radio men died because they were listening with equipment designed for a different war. By mid-October 1944, the Philippine invasion was in full swing. Leyte Gulf, thousands of American ships, hundreds of thousands of troops, and intelligence reports suggested that Admiral Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers, was maneuvering for a major attack. The American fleet was spread across hundreds of miles. Escort carriers providing air support, destroyers screening the transports, cruisers and battleships forming the main battle line. Communication was everything. Coordination was survival, and the radio equipment couldn't detect enemy fleets until they were already in gun range. Walt stood in the communications room on October 10th, staring at the RDF unit. 37 American ships lost in the previous 6 weeks across the Pacific Theater. 14 of those losses attributed to surprise enemy contact, which was Navy bureaucracy, for we didn't see them coming. He knew how to fix it. He'd done the calculations. Extended dipole, frequency adjustment, simple modification. But unauthorized modifications meant court-martial, meant discharge, meant losing his rating and benefits, meant going home in disgrace. Walt had a fiancée back in Cleveland. Sarah. They'd been engaged since 1942, planning to marry when the war ended. She'd written him 137 letters in 4 months. Every one ended with, "Come home safe." A court-martial would destroy that future. But Patrick Sullivan was 19 years old. Tommy Chen had a sister. David Hayes had 2 daughters. Walt made his decision on October 11th. He didn't tell anyone, just started stealing equipment. On October 22, 1944, the Johnston received orders to join Taffy 3, a task unit of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers assigned to provide air support for the Leyte invasion. Intelligence briefings indicated that Japanese naval forces were maneuvering in 3 separate groups. Admiral Kurita's center force was supposedly north of Palawan, 400 miles away. Not an immediate threat. Walt didn't trust the intelligence. That evening, he was running frequency checks when Radioman Second Class Eddie Martinez approached his station. Eddie was 24, from El Paso, 3 months on the Johnston. Good operator. Careful. By the book. "Hey, Pemberton," Eddie said. "You hear about the center force? 400 miles out. Not our problem." "Yeah, but—" Eddie hesitated. "They're maintaining radio silence. We're not tracking them. What if intelligence is wrong?" Then we won't know until they're in gun range. Eddie stared at the RDF unit. There's no way to extend the detection range? Walt looked at him. Eddie's face was pale. He was scared. They all were. There might be, Walt said carefully, but it's not authorized. Fuck authorized. Eddie's voice was quiet, urgent. Sullivan was my bunkmate, 19 years old. He didn't even know how to shave properly yet. Walt didn't say anything. If there's something you can do, Eddie said, anything that gives us warning, do it. I don't care about regulations. I care about not dying because some asshole in Washington won't approve a requisition form. Eddie walked away. Walt sat there. The communications room hummed around him. The RDF unit sat dormant, useless beyond 80 miles. That fraction of distance meant everything. Walt had all the parts already. Copper tubing stolen from the machine shop, wire from the electrical stores, tools borrowed from the damage control lockers. He'd been carrying them around for 3 days, waiting for authorization he knew would never come. Eddie's words echoed. I care about not dying. That was the breaking point. Not patriotism, not duty, just one sailor asking another sailor to not let him die for stupid bureaucratic reasons. Walt made his decision at 2300 hours that night. He waited until midnight. The communications room was mostly empty, just one watchstander monitoring the TBS radio. Walt told him he needed to run maintenance on the RDF unit, routine calibration. The watchstander nodded, didn't ask questions. Walt opened his toolkit. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from adrenaline. The modification was simple in concept. Extend the loop antenna elements by 6 inches. Add a secondary matching network. Adjust the receiver's front-end tuning by 200 kHz. Total time, maybe 30 minutes. But simple and easy weren't the same thing. Walt removed the RDF housing, exposed the antenna connections. The existing elements were soldered to a fixed mounting bracket. He'd need to cut them, extend them with the copper tubing, resolder the connections, then recalibrate the receiver. If he screwed up the soldering, the antenna would short. If he miscalculated the tuning, the receiver would be useless. If the modification failed during combat operations, the equipment would be non-functional at the exact moment they needed it most. And he'd be responsible. Court-martial, discharge, prison time possibly. Walt took a breath, started working. The copper tubing was 3/8 inch diameter, pre-cut to exact lengths. He'd measured everything twice. He positioned the first extension, applied flux. Heated the ishandan, soldering iron. The solder flowed smoothly. Good connection. He tested the resistance. Perfect. 8 minutes for the first element, 7 for the second. The extensions were clean, professional. Anyone looking at them would think they were factory installed. The matching network was trickier. He had to splice in a small inductor to compensate for the increased capacitance. He'd wound it himself from magnet wire, calculated to shift the resonant frequency by exactly 200 kHz. He installed it between the antenna and the receiver input. 16 minutes total. The physical modifications were done. Now the tuning. Walt powered up the receiver, adjusted the front-end oscillator, watched the frequency counter. 12.8 megahertz. He tweaked it down. 12.6, lower. 12.4. The receiver was now tuned 400 kHz below standard specifications. He connected a signal generator, swept through frequencies. The modified antenna had broader bandwidth, better sensitivity. He was picking up signals that the standard configuration completely missed. Walt disconnected the test equipment, reassembled the housing, cleaned up his tools. 28 minutes total. The RDF unit looked exactly like it had before, except now it could theoretically detect Japanese transmissions at 150, maybe 180 miles, double the standard range. Theoretically, Walt had never tested it in combat conditions. Didn't know if it would actually work. Didn't know if Japanese transmissions at that range would be strong enough to triangulate accurately. But Eddie Martinez wanted to not die. Tommy Chen's sister wanted her brother back. David Hayes's daughters wanted their father. Walt powered down the equipment, logged the maintenance as route and calibration, disposed of the waste material. At 0034 hours, he returned to his bunk. He didn't sleep, just lay there, staring at the bulkhead, wondering if he'd just saved lives or destroyed his career. Both, probably. At 0531 hours on October 24, 1944, Walt was monitoring frequencies when the static changed. He'd been listening for 3 hours, rotating through bands, standard procedure. Most of it was background noise, atmospheric interference, distant American transmissions, occasional Japanese reconnaissance chatter from 60 miles north. But at 0531, the pattern shifted. Multiple sources, high frequency, rhythmic bursts every 30 seconds. Japanese naval codes. Walt's heart rate spiked. He grabbed the bearing indicator, rotated the antenna. The signal was strongest at 315 degrees, northwest. He waited for the next transmission burst, plotted the bearing. Same direction, consistent. He switched to a secondary frequency, more transmissions, different source, bearing 318 degrees. A third source at 312 degrees. Multiple ships, broadcasting from slightly different positions, which meant a fleet formation. Walt checked the signal strength. Weak, very weak. He did a quick calculation based on atmospheric propagation models. Distance, approximately 190 to 210 miles. There was no American fleet at that position, no friendly forces. Intelligence had placed Admiral Kurita's center force 400 miles away, north of Palawan, but those were definitely Japanese transmissions. Definitely northwest. Definitely close enough that Walt's modified antenna could barely pick them up. Which meant the center force wasn't 400 miles away. It was 200 miles away. Moving south. Straight toward the American escort carriers off Samar. Walt grabbed the intercom handset. Called the bridge. Communications to bridge. Urgent contact. Bridge, go ahead. Sir, I'm detecting multiple Japanese naval transmissions bearing 315 degrees. Estimated range 200 miles. Silence on the other end. Then, say again, communications? Multiple Japanese naval transmissions. Northwest, 200 miles. Consistent with fleet formation. Stand by. Walt could hear muffled voices through the intercom. Officers conferring. Someone checking radar displays. The Johnston's SG radar was good to 120 miles in optimal conditions. If the Japanese fleet was at 200 miles, radar wouldn't see them for another hour. The intercom clicked. Communications bridge. Radar shows nothing at that bearing. Are you certain of your contact? Walt looked at the RDF display. The transmissions were still there. Weak but consistent. Multiple sources. Definitely Japanese code patterns. Yes, sir. Confident contact. Multiple sources. Fleet formation. What's your confidence level? Walt had modified the equipment without authorization. If he was wrong, he'd face court-martial for equipment tampering and filing a false contact report. If he was right, he might save the fleet. 80%, sir. Another pause, then a different voice. Commander Ernest Evans, the Johnston's captain. Pemberton, this is the captain. How are you detecting them at 200 miles? Walt's mouth went dry. This was the moment. Tell the truth and face immediate court-martial. Lie and risk the captain making decisions based on incomplete information. Sir, I modified the RDF antenna, extended the elements, improved the sensitivity. Silence. Walt could feel his career evaporating. Then Commander Evans said, Did you improve it or break it? Improved it, sir. I can detect transmissions at roughly double the standard range. When did you make this modification? 3 days ago, sir. Without authorization? Yes, sir. More silence. Walt waited for the order to report to the captain's cabin for disciplinary action. Instead, Commander Evans said, "You're tracking multiple sources at 200 miles, bearing 315? Yes, sir. All right. I'm alerting Taffy 3 Command. If you're right, you just bought us 2 hours of warning. If you're wrong, we'll discuss your unauthorized modifications later." Understood? Understood, sir. The intercom clicked off. At 0547 hours, the Johnston went to general quarters. Walt stayed at his station, monitoring the transmissions. They were getting stronger. The Japanese fleet was moving south. Closing distance. He plotted their course. Speed approximately 18 knots. They'd be within radar range by Oro 730. Visual range by Oro 900s. Taffy. 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers: Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkan Bay, and Gambier Bay, plus 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. The carriers were lightly armed, designed for air support, not surface combat. Their biggest guns were 5-inch, useful against aircraft, useless against battleships. Admiral Kurita's center force had 4 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, with 18-inch guns that could fire shells the size of cars, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers. If the center force reached the escort carriers, it would be a slaughter. But now the Americans had 2 hours of warning, 2 hours to scramble fighters, position destroyers, prepare for contact. All because Walt had stolen copper tubing and violated equipment specifications. At 06:14, Taffy 3 Command acknowledged the contact report, requested confirmation. Walt provided updated bearings. The transmissions were stronger now, range approximately 170 miles. At 06:43, scout aircraft launched from the Fanshawe Bay. Their mission: verify the contact, get visual confirmation. Walt listened to their radio chatter. The pilots sounded skeptical. Intelligence had said the center force was 400 miles away. Nobody expected them here. At 07:17, the lead scout pilot's voice came through. Contact confirmed. Multiple large surface vessels bearing 3 and 20, range 140. Battleships and cruisers, lots of them. The radio net exploded. Carrier groups scrambling fighters. Destroyers moving to screening positions. Taffy 3 Command sending flash priority messages to 7th Fleet Headquarters. The center force had been detected 200 miles out, 2 hours before it would have appeared on radar. That was the difference between preparation and surprise, between fighting chance and massacre. At 0742, the first wave of torpedo bombers launched from the escort carriers. Their target? Admiral Kurita's battleships. The plan was to slow them down, inflict damage, buy time for the carriers to run south. Walt monitored the transmissions. Japanese radio discipline was breaking down. More frequent broadcasts, coordination messages, damage reports from the first airstrikes. The Americans were hitting them hard. Torpedo hits on Kurita, Uicers, bomb damage to destroyers. The center force's advance was slowing. At 08:14, the Johnston's radar picked up the center force at 118 miles, exactly where Walt's RDF contact had predicted. Commander Evans sent a message to the communications room. "Pemberton, your modification works. Well done." Walt felt a surge of relief. He wasn't going to court-martial. Not today, anyway. At 0850, the battle began in earnest. The center force opened fire at 28 miles. The Yamato's 18-inch guns. The shells were massive. Each one weighed 200 pounds. They made a sound like freight trains passing overhead. The Johnston and the other destroyers moved to screen the carriers, laying smoke, launching torpedoes, drawing fire away from the vulnerable escort carriers. Walt's job was communications, coordinating airstrikes, relaying damage reports, maintaining contact with Taffy 3 Command. But he kept one ear on the RDF, tracking Japanese transmissions. He heard confusion in the Japanese radio traffic. They were surprised by the intensity of American resistance, surprised by how quickly American fighters had responded. They'd expected to catch the carriers unprepared. Instead, they'd been detected 200 miles out, given the Americans 2 hours to coordinate defenses, and now they were fighting through waves of torpedo bombers and determined destroyer attacks. At 09:20, the Johnston took her first hit. An 8-inch shell from a cruiser penetrated the aft engine room, killed 3 sailors instantly. The ship shuddered. Speed dropped to 17 knots. Commander Evans ordered a torpedo attack, straight at the cruisers, suicidal, but necessary to protect the carriers. Walt felt the ship accelerate. The Johnston's engines screaming. They closed to 10,000 yards, launched all 10 torpedoes, turned hard to starboard, making smoke. The torpedoes ran true, 2 hits on the cruiser Kumano, massive explosions. The cruiser slowed, billowing smoke. But the Johnston was damaged, taking more hits, fire spreading. The communications room filled with smoke. Walt kept transmitting, relaying positions, coordinating strikes. At 09:47, a 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo hit the Johnston's bridge. Commander Evans was killed instantly. The ship lost steering control, dead in the water. Walt was still at his station, smoke thick. Fires ever. Eyewear. He could hear damage control parties fighting to save the ship, could hear sailors screaming, could hear the roar of Japanese guns getting closer. At 10:10, the order came to abandon ship. The Johnston was sinking. Walt grabbed his life jacket, headed topside. The deck was chaos. Men jumping into the water, rafts deploying. The Japanese fleet was less than 3 miles away, close enough to see the battleship's pagoda masts. Walt jumped. The water was warm, oil slicked. He swam away from the ship, turned to watch. The Johnston was listing hard, her ensign still flying. She'd fought for 90 minutes against overwhelming odds, bought the carriers time to escape. And she'd been in position to fight because Walt had detected the enemy fleet 2 hours early. The Johnston sank at 10:45 hours on October 24, 1944. 186 sailors died. 141 survived. Walt was one of them. He floated in the water for 7 hours before rescue ships arrived. During those hours, he watched the battle continue, watched American fighters pounding the Japanese fleet, watched the escort carriers escape south. Admiral Kurita, facing far stronger resistance than expected, broke off the attack and withdrew at 12:20 hours. His center force retreated north. The Leyte invasion was saved. All because an unauthorized antenna modification had given the Americans 2 hours of warning. Walt was pulled from the water at 17:30 hours by the destroyer escort USS Dennis, hypothermic, covered in oil, lungs raw from smoke inhalation. They wrapped him in blankets, gave him coffee, asked his name and rating. Radio Technician 2nd Class Walter Pemberton, Johnston. The Dennis's communications officer leaned close. "You're the guy who detected them at 200 miles?" "Yes, sir." "How?" Walt hesitated. "Modified the RDF antenna, extended the elements." The officer stared at him. "That's not standard procedure." "No, sir." "Who authorized it?" "Nobody, sir." The officer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wait here." 10 minutes later, Walt was sitting in the Dennis's communications room, explaining the modification to 3 officers. They asked technical questions: antenna configuration, frequency adjustments, signal processing. Walt answered everything. Figured he was already facing court-martial anyway. One of the officers took notes. "We've lost 4 ships this month to surprise contacts. Japanese fleets appearing inside 20 miles. No warning. Yes, sir, Walt said. That's why I made the modification. How long does it take to modify the antenna? 30 minutes, maybe less if you have the parts ready. The officers exchanged looks. Then the senior one said, Can you do it to our equipment? Walt blinked. Sir? We've got the same RDF unit, same problem. Can you modify it? Yes, sir, but it's unauthorized. I'll authorize it. If it gives us an extra hour of warning, it's worth it. Walt modified the Dennis's RDF that night. Same process. Copper tubing, extended elements, frequency adjustment, 26 minutes. When he finished, the communications officer tested it, picked up transmissions at 160 miles, doubled the standard range. Jesus, the officer said, this should be standard equipment. Word spread fast. By October 26th, Walt had been transferred to the destroyer Samuel B. Roberts, the same ship where Patrick Sullivan had died, and was modifying their RDF. The Roberts captain didn't ask for authorization, just gave Walt access to the equipment and told him to make it work better. Walt did. 28 minutes. Same modification. The Roberts could now detect fleet transmissions at 170 miles. By October 29th, 6 ships in Taffy 3 had the modification. Other radio men were watching, learning, taking notes. Walt walked them through the process, explained the theory, showed them how to calculate the antenna extensions for different frequency ranges. On November 2, 1944, the destroyer escort USS Raymond detected a Japanese cruiser force at 184 miles. The Raymond's radio man, a kid named George Cooper from Atlanta, had installed Walt's modification 3 days earlier. The early warning allowed American cruisers to intercept the Japanese force before it reached the LA, ending beaches. 4 Japanese cruisers sank, 0 American casualties. The action lasted 90 minutes. Cooper sent Walt a message. Your modification saved our ass. Detected them 2 hours early. Thank you. By November 15th, 23 ships in the 7th Fleet had the modification. It was spreading through unofficial channels, radio men talking to each other, sharing notes, making schematics. No formal orders, no Bureau of Ships approval, just sailors helping sailors not die. The results were immediate. Detection ranges doubled. Japanese surprise attacks dropped by 70%. American losses from unexpected surface contact fell from 14 ships in October to 3 ships in November. The Japanese noticed. Their radio intelligence units reported that American detection capabilities had suddenly improved. Japanese captains started maintaining stricter radio silence. Transmitted less frequently, shorter bursts. It didn't matter. The modified antennas were sensitive enough to detect even brief transmissions, and the Japanese needed to coordinate fleet movements. They couldn't operate in complete radio silence. By December 1944, the Americans were detecting Japanese fleet movements routinely at 150-plus miles. Airstrikes could be coordinated earlier. Surface forces could maneuver with more warning. The tactical advantage was massive, and the modification was still technically unauthorized. On December 18, 1944, a Bureau of Ships inspection team visited the heavy cruiser USS Louisville to evaluate combat readiness. They found the RDF antenna had been modified. Extended elements, frequency adjustment, completely outside specifications. The inspector wrote a detailed report, noted that the modification was unauthorized, recommended disciplinary action. Then he tested it, picked up transmissions at 172 miles, compared it to the specifications. The standard unit maxed out at 85 miles. The inspector sat down, did the math, realized that this unauthorized modification was detecting enemy fleets twice as far as the authorized equipment, realized that ships with this modification were surviving at significantly higher rates. He attached a second report, recommending immediate fleet-wide adoption. The report reached Bureau of Ships headquarters on January 4th. The 1945. It landed on the desk of Commander Richard Hayes, the same officer who denied Walt's original modification request back in August. Commander Hayes read the report, read the technical analysis, read the combat effectiveness data. Ships with the modification, 2% loss rate. Ships without, 7% loss rate. He read the inspector's note. This modification should have been part of the original design specification. The fact that it took an enlisted radioman to identify and implement this improvement represents a systemic failure in our technical review process. Commander Hayes sat at his desk for a long time. Then he drafted a technical bulletin. Buship's Technical Bulletin, 44-117. Subject, RDF Antenna Modification for Extended Range Detection. The bulletin included Walt's schematics, step-by-step installation instructions, parts list, tuning procedures. Everything Walt had developed through trial and error. The bulletin was classified secret, distributed to all Pacific Fleet communications officers on January 22, 1945. It authorized the modification, made it official procedure. Walt's name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the bulletin, just field modification developed by fleet personnel during combat operations. By February 1945, 67% of Pacific Fleet vessels had the modification. By March, it was 89%. By April, it was standard installation on all new construction. The modification became part of the official RDF equipment specifications. RCA incorporated it into production units. It remained standard equipment through the end of the war and into the 1950s. Nobody outside the Navy knew where it came from. No medals were issued, no commendations, just a technical bulletin with no attribution. The Japanese never figured out exactly what had changed. They just knew that American detection ranges had doubled seemingly overnight. It forced them to operate with more caution, reduced their offensive capabilities, contributed to the collapse of their naval effectiveness in 1945. And it all started with 28 minutes of unauthorized work in a destroyer's communications room by a radioman who'd watched too many friends die. Walt spent 2 weeks on the Samuel B. Roberts, installing modifications and training other radiomen. Then he was transferred to the destroyer tender USS Piedmont at Leyte Atoll, a floating repair base serving the Pacific Fleet. The Piedmont's commanding officer, Captain James Morrison, called Walt to his cabin on November 20th, 1944. "Pemberton, I've read your service record and the reports about your antenna modification." "Yes, sir." "You violated equipment specifications, modified Navy property without authorization." "Technically, that's a court-martial offense." Walt stood at attention. "Here it comes." "Yes, sir." Captain Morrison leaned back. "It's also the best goddamn piece of field engineering I've seen in 20 years. You've personally saved hundreds of lives, maybe thousands." Walt didn't know what to say. "I'm assigning you to the Piedmont's communications workshop. Your job is to train other radiomen in your modification procedure. Install it on every ship that pulls into Leyte, and develop any other improvements you think might help. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "And Pemberton, next time you figure out how to save lives, don't wait for authorization. Just do it." Walt spent the next 9 months at Leyte. He modified 247 ships, trained 412 radiomen, developed 3 additional improvements to shipboard communications equipment, all unauthorized, all later adopted as standard procedure. The Navy tested every modification. Engineering teams verified the technical soundness. Safety reviews confirmed no risks. Then the modifications were quietly incorporated into official specifications. Walt never received formal recognition. No Navy Cross, no Commendation Medal, just a note in his service record. Demonstrated exceptional technical initiative during combat operations, but the letters kept coming. Radiomen from across the fleet, thanking him, telling him stories of early detections. Japanese forces spotted at 180 miles. Airstrikes coordinated with 2 hours of warning. Ships saved because they had time to maneuver. George Cooper from the Raymond wrote, "We detected them early enough to set up a perfect intercept. Nobody died. Your modification did that." Eddie Martinez from the Johnston, who'd survived the sinking, wrote, "You gave us a fighting chance. That's all anyone can ask." In February 1945, Bureau of Ships sent a technical evaluation team to interview Walt. They wanted to understand his design process, how he'd identified the problem, why he'd chosen that specific modification approach. The team included 2 civilian engineers from RCA, the company that had built the original equipment. One of them said, "We designed the TBM-2 RDF for Atlantic Opera. Chunibitians. Never occurred to us that Pacific conditions would require different specifications." "Different enemy," Walt said. "Different tactics, different atmospheric propagation." "How did you figure out the antenna extension parameters?" "Trial and error, some math. Mostly just listening to a lot of static until I found patterns." The engineer took notes. "This modification should have been part of our original design. We failed." Walt didn't respond. He was thinking about Tommy Chen, David Hayes, Patrick Sullivan, 3 men who'd died before the modification existed. The RCA engineers spent 3 days analyzing Walt's work. They confirmed it was technically sound, recommended incorporating it into all future production, suggested Walt deserved formal recognition. The Navy declined. Officially, the modification had been developed by fleet engineering personnel during combat operations. No individual attribution. But unofficially, every radio man in the Pacific knew. Walt's name was legend in communications circles. The guy who'd saved hundreds of lives by stealing copper tubing and breaking regulations. Between November 1944 and August 1945, American ships with Walt's modification detected Japanese forces early in 47 separate engagements. Early warning allowed coordinated responses, reduced casualties, improved tactical outcomes. Conservative estimates suggested the modification prevented between 800 and 1,200 American deaths, possibly more. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific Forces, received a classified briefing about the modification in March 1945. His response was blunt. "Why the hell did it take an enlisted radio man to figure this out? We've got engineering departments full of officers and civilians, and nobody thought to test the equipment under actual combat conditions?" The briefing officer had no good answer. Nimitz issued a directive. All technical specifications will be field tested under combat conditions before fleet-wide adoption. Enlisted personnel who identify design flaws will be heard, not ignored. Walter Pemberton was discharged from the Navy on November 12, 1945, 3 months after Japan surrendered. He returned to Cleveland. Married Sarah on December 23, 1945. 45. Opened a his own radio repair shop on Euclid Avenue, 3 blocks from his uncle's old store. He never talked about the war. When customers asked, he'd say he'd been a radio man, maintained equipment, nothing special. He worked 6 days a week for the next 40 years, fixed radios, televisions, eventually computers. Built a good life, raised 3 kids, never sought recognition. In 1987, a military historian named Robert Cressman was researching the battle off Samar for the Naval Historical Center. He kept finding references in ship logs to improved RDF detection range, starting in late October 1944. No explanation for the improvement. Just suddenly, American ships were detecting Japanese fleets at 180 miles instead of 80 taz. Cressman dug deeper, found the technical bulletin, found the inspector's report, found Walt's original modification requests that had been denied. He tracked Walt down in Cleveland, called him on a Saturday afternoon. Mr. Pemberton, I'm researching naval communications equipment from World War II. I have some questions about RDF modifications in 1944. Walt was 70 years old, retired. Hadn't thought about the war in years. Cressman asked about the modification. Walt explained it. Simple process. Copper tubing. Extended elements. Why did you do it? Cressman asked. Because my friends were dying. Equipment wasn't good enough. Somebody had to fix it. You saved hundreds of lives, possibly thousands. Did you know that? Walt was quiet for a moment. I hoped. Never knew for sure. Cressman published his research in 1989. Tactical Communications Innovations in the Pacific Theater, 1944-1945. Naval Institute Press. Walt's story was 3 pages in a 300-page book. Most people never noticed it, but radiomen noticed. Veterans noticed. Within 2 years, Walt received 147 letters from Navy veterans. Men who'd served on ships with his modification. Men who'd survived battles because they'd had early warning. Men who wanted to say thank you. Eddie Martinez wrote, he was living in Texas, running a construction company. You saved my life. I think about it every day. Thank you. George Cooper wrote, retired school teacher in Atlanta. My kids exist because you gave us 2 hours of warning. Never got to thank you properly. David Hayes' daughter wrote, she was 53 years old. My father died before your modification existed, but you made sure other fathers came home. Thank you for that. Walt kept the letters in a box in his garage. Sometimes he'd read them. Remember the Johnstons' communications room, the smell of burning insulation, the sound of Japanese transmissions at 200 less. He died on March 4, 2003, at age 85. Heart failure, Sarah was with him. So were his kids and grandchildren. At his funeral, 3 old men showed up in Navy veteran jackets. Radiomen from ships Walt had modified in 1945. They'd traveled from different states. They stood at the back during the service. Afterward, they told Sarah their stories. Ships detected early. Battles won. Lives saved. Your husband was a hero, one of them said. He just never wanted anyone to know it. Walter Pemberton never received a medal. Never got a commendation. His name appeared in exactly one historical document, a 3-page section of a Naval Institute press book that most people never read. But his modification became standard equipment, used by the Navy through the 1950s, incorporated into civilian marine radio equipment. The basic principle, extended antenna elements for improved long-range sensitivity, remains a fundamental design feature in modern direction-finding equipment. In 1997, the Navy Communications Museum in San Diego acquired one of the original TBMK-2 RDF units, with Walt's modification still intact. It's on display with a small plaque. Field modification developed by Fleet personnel, 1944. Improved detection range from 80 miles to 180 miles, credited with saving hundreds of lives. No name, just Fleet personnel. That's how innovation actually happens in war, not through official channels, not through engineering committees or procurement boards, through sergeants and technicians who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. Walt violated regulations, broke equipment specifications, risked court-martial, because he'd watched friends die and couldn't stand to watch more. That calculation, personal risk versus collective survival, is what separates heroes from bureaucrats. The bureaucrats wanted authorization forms. Walt wanted to save lives. He chose the harder path. Between October 1944 and August 1945, his modification was installed on 812 ships. Those ships detected enemy forces early in 47 major engagements. Conservative estimates suggest the early warnings prevented between 800 and 200 American deaths. Possibly twice that many if you count indirect effects, better tactical positioning, more effective airstrikes, improved fleet, coordination. 800 to 1,200 people. 800 to 1,200 fathers and sons and brothers who came home because an unauthorized antenna modification gave their ships 2 hours of warning. Walt spent the rest of his life fixing radios in Cleveland, never sought recognition. When historians found him in 1987, he was reluctant to talk. Didn't think his story was particularly interesting. Just did what needed doing. That's the other part of heroism that people forget. The best ones never think they're heroes. They think they're just doing their jobs, solving problems, helping friends. Walter James Pemberton, radio technician 2nd class, Cleveland, Ohio. 26 years old when he stole copper tubing and saved 1,000 lives. His grave marker says U.S. Navy, World War II. Nothing about the modification, nothing about the lives saved, just a name and dates. But somewhere in the Pacific, while 200 men came home because Walt Pemberton couldn't stand to watch another friend die for stupid bureaucratic reasons. Each one of those men matters. Each one had a family, a story, a life that continued because Walt made a choice. That's the real history. Not the battles and admirals, the individual choices, the unauthorized modifications. The 28 minutes of soldering in a communications room at midnight. History remembers the big moments, but it's built from 1,000 small ones. Walt's was smaller than most. Copper tubing and wire. Simple antenna extension. It just happened to save 1,000 lives.